Welcome everyone, and thank you very much for coming this afternoon. My name is Lisa Gibbon. I am Director of the Social Change Enabling Impact Platform here at RMIT, and it's my pleasure to be launching this day, which is our first day of activities in the Social Change Symposium. I'm really pleased to see you all here, and I hope that you will leave today's event feeling very inspired and take a look at our website and see what else we have on offer this week. Including we have a workshop tomorrow. If you get really hooked in on podcasting after today's talk, we have a few spots I think still left in our workshop tomorrow. So do hit us up if that is of interest to you. Before we begin our formalities today, just guess. Do you want to click? Sorry. Oh, do I have? Maybe this works. Yay! Thank you. I just wanted to start with an acknowledgement of country. RMIT University acknowledges the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university today, and to pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. Before we introduce our keynote speaker today, I would like to ask Steve Gamson to come forward and just say a few words about the symposium, about the nature of it, and bring his welcome from the college, who co-sponsors the symposium with the Impact Platform. Steve.
Thanks, Lisa. Wow, it's a bit distracting talking up here. It's such a wonderful view of the city. Yeah, I'm Steve Gamson. I'm the HDR Director of the college, and in DSC, we have 750 HDR candidates. And in 2022, we decided to group those candidates through 3 research streams: creative practice research, urban futures, and social change. And through Lisa's social change platform, she has created a robust and engaging milestone for all of those HDR candidates. But more importantly, she's created an outstanding research symposium for academics and researchers from both in the college, outside the college, and also outside the university. This week's symposium overlaps really nicely with the children's content streaming era, and like Lisa said, Dallas will be talking as part of that tomorrow in his workshop. So if you are interested in podcasting, please do come along to that. I'd like to congratulate all the 40 candidates who are presenting milestones across the week. I know some of you are here today, so well done for you. I know a milestone is always a stressful time in your academic or your HDR journey, so well done for doing that, and it's great to have you as part of this symposium. I'd also like to thank all the professional staff who put on these events and have basically organised all of the HDR candidates for this symposium. So thanks to Jess Hattersley for her work and her great team, Alan Shanks and Nicole Scott, who are also doing other things in the scenes. But mostly, I would like to thank Lisa for her energy, for her enthusiasm, and also for her leadership in what she does in the social change platform, and also in creating this really fantastic event, which she started doing last year. And it's just a fantastic event, and it's a great template for now for others to sort of follow in what she's able to do. So thank you, Lisa, and I look forward to hearing Dallas. It sounds like a great presentation. So thanks very much.
Great, thank you so much, Steve, for those very kind words. I really appreciate it. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes to bring these events to you, and it's wonderful when things resonate and people come away thinking, yeah, that was really great, really cool, and really fits with what I'm doing. I'd like to remind everybody that we also have a reception following today's keynote. So in addition to some time for Q&A after the talk, please do stay around for some refreshments, and we can do a bit of hobnobbing and have a little bit of networking time. Without further ado, though, I would like to now introduce our keynote speaker, Dallas Rogers, who is head of Urbanism in the School of Architecture, Design and Planning at the University of Sydney. He works on the colonial and contemporary politics of land, housing, property, and urban development. His research spans urban and historical geography with a focus on the intersections of race, class, nature, technology, and capital. Dallas leads major studies of urbanism funded by the Australian Research Council and other government and non-government funders. His current studies include digital technologies and the private rental sector in Australia, inequality in Australia, housing in the asset society, and the university and the city. Dallas is editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Housing Policy. He's written well over 50 opinion pieces for The Guardian, the Sydney Morning Herald, and The Conversation. Dallas had graduate qualifications in radio production and produces radio features for ABC Radio National, and he's the founder of City Road Podcast, among other radio projects. It's really Dallas's podcast series and his profile in media that brought him to my attention, because as I've been thinking about how do we encourage people to think about impact of their research, to start to engage with community, I was really inspired by a lot of the work that he does to actually reach out into the community and use podcasting in particular as a bit of a unique strategy for engaging beyond the university's walls. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Dallas. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me down to Melbourne. It's really great to be back here. I've got a good voice, so I might put that a little bit away there. Yeah, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on today here in what we now know as Melbourne, but I'd also like to pay respects and acknowledge the Gadigal people whose land I live and work on in Sydney, what we now know as Sydney. You drive for me.
See if it's working now.
Oh yeah, there we go. So story, sound and radio are of course critical to Aboriginal knowledge and politics in Australia, and this is particularly true of where I live and work in Sydney. In 1988, a small Aboriginal community radio station in Redfern called 88.9 Radio Redfern became a critical player in the protests against the 1988 bicentenary Australian Day celebrations. These protests turned into the first Invasion Day rally in Australia. Aboriginal people came from all over Australia to Sydney, and they set up a camp down at Larkaroos at Kamay, or what we now know as Wappy Bay, in the days leading up to these protests. Radio Redfern started broadcasting information down at the camp at Larpa, and somewhat organically became a focal point for organising things like getting food into the camp and broadcasting messages out of the camp into communities many miles away over this thing that was called at this time wireless. Very quickly, the radio itself became a site of solidarity and community, and the protests were organised and coordinated over Radio Redfern's airwaves. In the lead up to the protest, Aboriginal broadcasters like Tiger Bales were telling people where to meet for the marches and what to expect from non-Aboriginal people and the authorities. And then during the protests, Tiger Bales and Aboriginal radio makers were live broadcasting from the protests via a new piece of technology called a mobile phone. At one point in the broadcast, Tiger Bales is confronted by the police. He makes it clear to the police that he's live on air, live on the radio. And in that moment, he uses the panopticon-like power of the radio to his advantage. Here's an excerpt from the broadcast. Tiger Bale says, "Yes, we do have a large number of police here, and we're going to air throughout Queensland and New South Wales. Yeah, we've got the police moving in here, and they're going through the crowd. They're just coming here to intimidate violence and look for things like that." And in her excellent analysis of radio in these protests, Emma Colbert suggests the appearance of the police alters the coverage of the events broadcast on Radio Redfern, where previously the station had sought to convey the main planned events as the protests moved through Sydney as directly as possible. The arrival of the police results in the station changing its focus. As Bales physically moves through the crowd to question the police, Radio Redfern's coverage also moves to the physical periphery of the rally, but to the heart of the politics. And there's an excellent documentary about Radio Redfern's role in the first Invasion Day rally in Sydney, which is simply called 88.9 Radio Redfern. And this documentary shows just how important radio can be to how we advocate for change in the world. Radio is a platform that we can build things upon. Radio is a medium we can use to organise and advocate for a better world. Radio is a technological system that we can use to amplify the voices that are important to hear, but are often marginalised. Radio can be a form of social organisation. It's a process that we can enter into rather than something we can just turn on. And that's what I want to talk about this afternoon for a few minutes. Radio and podcasting really is a political process. And I want to suggest that there's perhaps three ways we could use radio and podcasting as academics. The first is to tell your own research story. The second is to build a research community. And the third is to amplify the voices of others. I'll talk about each of these by simply just telling you some stories about making radio and podcast as an academic. And I thought it might be fun, actually, to work in reverse chronological order this afternoon. So I'll start with literally just last weekend. Last weekend, we finished a 2-month-long gallery takeover event on Saturday, which was called Amplify, Story, Resistance and Radio. And Amplify was part live radio performance, part tutoring workshop, and part sound exhibition about the importance of amplification and listening in urban politics. Amplify, was a living, breathing example of how stories occupy urban space and generate solidarity. It was a response, really, to long-standing calls to protect music and creative spaces in our cities, to create a more diverse media landscape, and to champion First Nations music and journalism. This takeover invited people to share stories about sound and activism in the city through live broadcasts from the gallery and visual communications on the wall, covering key moments of amplification on the past. Back in 2018, I wrote a paper on podcasting with my radio mate, Miles Herbert. And in that paper, we offer a kind of like a critical checklist for academic podcasting. We suggest in that paper that before you start recording a podcast, you should consider the power relations or interests you'll be reinforcing or challenging or undermining in your podcast project. The checklist walks you through a series of questions that are organised around 5 broad steps in the podcasting process. So, initiating the podcast, expressing yourself through the podcast, disseminating your podcast, thinking about the impression you're making through the podcast, and then reflecting on the podcast over time. These are all important, obviously, but I want to just pause for a sec on the questions here around expression, or how we're expressing ourselves through the podcast. And these questions are: who will be the host, voices, and what collections of sound will be on the podcast? Will you be mimicking or subverting mainstream broadcast standards? Will you be speaking as an authority or something else? Will you be exposing silences in the public or disciplinary debate? Will you provide space for powerful or marginalised voices to speak up? Will your podcast be entertainment, teaching, or research? Will your podcast lead to social, cultural, or political change? And how will you set the podcast tone and soundscape of your podcast? And so you can see that I've been interested in the politics of this medium for a while now, and I suggest that we can use radio and podcasts in ways, or radio and podcast can be used in ways that perpetuate the discriminatory forces that exist in society, be it racism, classism, capitalism, patriarchy, but we can also use this medium of social organisation to challenge these discriminatory forces, and that's what I'm particularly interested in. And I mean this in a very practical sense. We can challenge the discriminatory forces by thinking carefully about how and why we make radio or podcasts, and why we communicate research at all, for that matter. It's not just about what we're saying on these mediums, although that is important. It's also about who is saying it, and how we're saying it, and who is listening, and who is not listening. In the Amplify Gallery takeover, we tried to really honour this commitment to think seriously about how we create spaces that amplify the voices that we feel we need to hear from the most. And that's why we literally called this gallery takeover Amplify. Amplify really became a platform that we could build something on, a prefigurative medium that we could use to organise a set of activities that would allow us to show that a different world is possible. Amplify was a space we used to amplify the voices we wanted to hear from most. So the first thing we did was we organised a screening of the 88.9 Radio Redfern documentary in the space. And we asked Radio Skid Row, another community radio station in Sydney with a very strong history of radio broadcasting, to organise a panel discussion after the film. Radio Redfern invited Binawee Bales, who is this amazing Aboriginal leader, to MC the event. And we also invited Luke Pearson, founder, of course, of and CEO of Indigenous X, to sit on the panel too. Indigenous X itself is this amazing media platform that Luke Pearson created to allow First Nations journalists and others to write about First Nations issues and really to celebrate First Nations media and journalism. Radio Skid Row also invited Graham Davis King, who was around Radio Redfern when the 1988 protests were taking place, to sit on the panel as well. We watched the documentary together and we yarned about what it meant to be making radical media today. And at the end of the event, we sung Happy Birthday for Tiger Bales, who would have been 70 years old that week. And then Binawee, Tiger Bales' daughter, performed a cultural song and dance to honour her father. It really was an insanely powerful afternoon. We laughed, many people cried during the documentary, and we talked about serious issues, and we also joked about funny things in life. If you want to listen to this event, although it's very hard to capture the power of it on audio, we do have all the audio recordings up on the Amplify website for that film screening and panel discussion. We also ran a pirate radio station from the gallery space, and the history of pirate radio stations is really fascinating. Obviously don't have time to go into it now, but basically it's where a group of people who are politically motivated get a radio broadcast equipment. So basically they get a transmitter and a transmission tower, and they start broadcasting without a license to whoever will listen. We used this idea and ran a pirate radio podcast from the gallery space and invited anyone to come to the gallery and take over this station. Heaps of people came in to interview their favourite political activists and musicians about sound and music and all things politics in the city. But we started the event with a blackout. So First Nations radio producer interviewing First Nations journalists, academics and musicians on the opening day of the takeover. All of that content is also online, also some extremely powerful interviews. City Road Podcast, so my podcast show, also took over the pirate radio station for a few days. And I curated a set of interviews about music, music businesses and music production and social lives of music in the city. I talked with RMIT's Dr. Sarah Taylor about the history of music in the city and the dangers of gentrification. I talked with University of Wollongong's Professor Chris Gibson about the role of creative industries in our cities and the gentrification of rehearsal studios. These somewhat invisible spaces, rehearsal studios, is what makes music in our cities possible. I also got RMIT's Dr. Liz Taylor, yes, Sarah's sister, to produce a whole series of interviews on this theme of music, creative industries in the cities too. And then I went to some radio and academic friends in Queensland and got Dr. Nat Osborne from Griffith Uni to produce a show out of 4ZZZ in Brisbane. And a whole bunch of other cool things happened as well, like some founding members of the Australian Band of the Year also produced a pirate radio series, and all of that content is online from those pirate radio takeovers. Gentrification and the loss of cultural diversity are really some of my core research interests. So I really viewed this whole pirate radio program as core research business for me. But not everyone would kind of see it that way. Not everyone would see me hanging out in the gallery making radio or podcasts as core research business. I think you should think about that. Come back to that in a little bit. I think the take-home point here about the Amplify Gallery takeover is that we can use radio and podcasting as a platform to hear from others. Part of being a good radio host or being a good radio producer is about being a good listener, or even knowing when to get out of the way, knowing when it's time to hand the microphone to someone else. This leads me to the second project I'd like to talk about, and that's actually making proper radio for ABC Radio National. Is the Amplify Gallery takeover allowed me the space and freedom to be creative with the way I curated the podcast content. Working as a contracted radio producer for Radio National is an entirely different gig altogether. The ABC put much tighter parameters around what you can do and say, how long your piece can be, what it should sound like, and who it should target in terms of the audience. But making radio for Radio National was a dream come true, particularly for me. And making radio for the Philosopher's Zone was an especially special thing for me to do. I had grown up listening to the Philosopher's Zone and always loved it. So having the chance to make some Philosopher's Zone episodes was a real treat. I've made 7 episodes of the Philosopher's Zone so far, including a 3-part series on housing, top there. But apart from my own dreams of making radio for the Philosopher's Zone, what's so special about making research-informed radio for Radio National? Quite simply, it's exposure. It's exposure that the medium brings you. You have a direct line to the nation, to a national platform to communicate your research. In total, I had 3.5 hours of time to tell research-informed stories to whoever was listening to the radio or tuning in the podcast. Given that the show is broadcast on Saturdays and repeated on Thursdays, it was really probably something like 7 hours of national radio time to play with to tell research-informed stories. Unlike a podcast show, where you get to set the tone and you get to talk for as long as you want, and you get to organise the interviews however you like, working with the ABC requires you to structure your radio episode in a particular way. In fact, you even need to pitch your episode to the executive producer in a particular way just to get a foot into the door. And there's some useful lessons here for us, I think, about pitching radio and the production process that we can drag into thinking about research-informed communication. All radio stations, including Radio National, are audience-focused. That means everything is organised around securing, maintaining and building an audience. If the radio show doesn't have an audience, it'll be cut. If If your radio station doesn't have an audience, it's going to die. Audience is everything in radio, and radio stations and executive producers know how to capture audience. Since they're really good at it, it's kind of like a core part of their job. So when I pitch an interview to Radio National, I start with the audience. And I tell the show's producer why this interview will capture, maintain and build the target audience for this show and that radio station, and why this content is needed right now. The trick here is that the pitch is about the audience, not the idea per se. Of course you need a good idea, but the purpose of the idea is to capture, maintain and to build the target audience. Or at least that's what you're telling the producer when you pitch it. I'm an academic, of course. I love ideas. Even if nobody else likes them. For radio producers and other editors for that matter, so think about the conversation or newspapers, they love audiences. And luckily, for us, most of their audiences love ideas too. So to effectively pitch or bring an idea to a radio producer or a newspaper editor, you need to switch into producer or editor mode. And think to yourself, what would the average audience member for this show or publication find interesting about this idea? And to answer that question, you need to know what the target audience is for the show and what the current audience profile for the radio station or publication is too. Now, you can usually find some of this information online with a bit of digging. Here are some broad stats for the conversation and Radio National's audiences. Radio National's a bit old. But the first thing that the radio producer sends you when they commission your radio piece is a detailed breakdown of the station and the show's audience. This will include things like the gender profile of the audience, the average age of the audience, the educational profile of the audience. But they'll also often give you, and they're asking you to fit into the parameters of this audience profile, to engage this audience. They'll also tell you to do things like think about the tone, style, and pitch of the show. So how the show should be structured, how the show should sound, and the educational pitch of the show. For the philosopher's zone, the tone of the show is kind of like highbrow intellectual, but with this quite casual interview format. It's actually got more casual over time. The educational pitch is at first year undergrad level, which is actually quite high for a kind of like national broadcaster. So in other words, the interview must be comprehensible to the average first year undergrad student in any degree program. The reason that the show has these productions rules is very simple. The show's audience is expecting this tone, style, and pitch. There are some things you need to do as a radio maker to make sure you're hitting this tone, style, and pitch. But effectively, if you turn in your interview or story or episode to the producer and you're not hitting those marks, they're going to send it back to you and ask you to change it. So I think here there's a few take-home points that are also useful for us for research communication more generally. First, when we're trying to engage people with our research findings, we'll have the greatest impact when we're audience-focused. And being audience-focused requires us to understand who our audience is as a starting point. So if you're writing for the conversation, or talking on the radio, or talking to a future funder even, talking to a government partner, you'll get better traction if you understand who you're talking to as an audience. Secondly, you might need to change the tone, style, and pitch of how you communicate your research to suit different types of audiences. So I think so far we've got a couple of key take-home messages. The first one is create spaces that amplify the voices we need to hear. The second one is be audience-focused with your research communication. And the third one is change the style, tone, and pitch of your research to suit different audiences. If you kind of head towards the end of this talk, I want to wrap up with some comments about using podcast and radio in my research that will give us a kind of final set of takeaways. And this really is a story about my own research project, but it's about how my own institution, the University of Sydney, has kind of engaged with my podcast project over time. Some of the challenges I've faced in my own institution. Get into this by telling you a little bit about City Road Podcast, the podcast that I manage. In 2017, I moved from Western Sydney University to the University of Sydney. I had a podcast show when I was at Western Sydney University called Sound Minds Radio, which I started with someone I studied radio production with at the Australian Film, Television and Radio School. Sound Minds Radio was an interview-driven podcast where we interviewed academics about their research. It was called Sound Minds Radio because a lot of people didn't quite know what podcasting was at this time. We also broadcasted the podcast show on radio, community radio, so we decided to call it Sound Minds Radio. But by 2017, when I arrived at the University of Sydney, podcasting was more well known. And so I wrapped up Sound Minds Radio and I decided to create a new podcast show about cities and urban life. And it was interesting to watch how my new colleagues and the university bureaucracy kind of responded to this idea. To start with, I had formal qualifications in radio production from one of Australia's leading radio schools, and I also had some experience in making radio and podcasts, including the very recent Sound Minds Radio show, where I've been interviewing academics about their work and trying to engage with this idea of using radio and research communication and putting them together. The Sound Minds Radio went onto the Community Radio Network pretty quickly. That's a national network that local community radio stations pull content down from and play. And I also had helped the Conversation set up their first podcast project, the Speaking With series, back in 2014. So it wasn't like I was pitching some new idea to the uni with no skills or experience in this area. I had been doing podcasts for a while by then. My pitch was basically that podcasting is this new form of research dissemination. We need to get ahead of the curve. And I said to them, the style and the tone of the podcast is simple enough. We'll do a 20, 30-minute interview. There'll be a host and one interviewee. I'll focus on producing high-quality recordings, and I'll just use the same interview schedule for each episode. Broadly speaking, we'll have a conversation, but it'll be about these things. What is your idea? How did you come to this idea? Why is this idea important? The target was to build a small audience of well-informed urbanists working in academia, government, and the not-for-profit sector. So we didn't want to build a hugely big show, very targeted. And I pitched this show to my discipline at school, and they were immediately supportive. They just said, yeah, we love it. They even gave me some money. They said, here is $5,000 to get it going. After I had my school support, I contacted the university's sort of wider bureaucracy with some small marketing and communications approvals. I wanted to brand the new podcast project with the University of Sydney's branding material and get a University of Sydney webpage for the podcast. It didn't seem like a strange request to me at the time because there were lots of public-facing research dissemination websites on the broader University of Sydney web infrastructure, like this one, which is Sydney Business Insights, which I pointed to when I had the meeting with them, and this collection of people out of business school who I met with were doing short research-informed videos at the time. But things got a bit weird at this time when I engaged with the university's sort of bureaucratic machinery. I met with the relevant people. I told them about the podcast. I told them I had the school support. I told them the school had given me some money. I told them I had the experience to do it. And I asked them to create me a web page. And could you make it look like this, please? I'll just be doing audio instead of audio and video like these people. They said to me, no, you already have a podcast project in the works. The Uni of Sydney is committed to one podcast at the uni. So we can't help you. And more than that, the uni's got a podcast, so we don't want you to make your podcast. Please don't make your podcast. Basically, cease and desist with your podcast. So I said to them, like, do you have any idea what's coming? Like, hundreds of academics are going to be making podcasts very soon. Every second research project is, in a year or so, is going to have a podcast. Just have a conversation, set up a podcast. Like, you really need to, like, get ahead of this. And they said, no, no website, no branding, no podcast, please. And it was really like saying, going to them and saying, I might write some journal articles. And they say, no, Dave's writing the journal articles. Dave's over there. So it was a very strange meeting. I walked back to my office, I set up a podcast website then and then, and I got to work making the first 5 episodes of the podcast. And basically, I just forgot about that meeting. I planned out what I was going to talk about, picked 5 topical ideas, topical in 2017. This was a time when Airbnb and foreign real estate investment were big ideas in the news. Smart cities was something that people were talking about. So I decided to do Airbnb in cities, pets in cities, foreign investment in cities, digital cities, and smart cities. I arrived at the University of Sydney in February 2017, and these podcasts went live in April, so just a few months after I arrived. I put a lot of work into, I take audio seriously. Some people say too seriously, and I put a lot of work in making them sound nice. We recorded them in a nice room, we used nice equipment, took a lot of care with editing the first 5 episodes, and which, by the way, if you want to attract an audience, be kind to them, make your podcast sound nice. Your audience won't notice, but they'll keep coming back for more. Within a month, 2SER, which is another community radio station in Sydney, one of the biggest community radio stations, reached out to me. They asked, they'd heard the first 5 episodes. They said, we partner with you and put a show on the radio. I said, yes, that sounds great. We formed a partnership. We started broadcasting on the radio, much like we've done with Soundminds. This partnership gave me access to 2SER's production team, and Radio Skid Row City Road Podcast recruited a radio producer for the station to work with our podcast team. So effectively, I got some more money off my school after they heard the first 5 episodes, and we employed someone. That person was Miles Herbert, who I've been writing some things about podcasting with. He also now works for the Guardian's podcast. By the end of 2017, we had a popular show on 2SER, and we're on the national community radio network as well. And a whole bunch of people were, by the end of the year, reaching out to us and asking us to help them start a podcast. And I was getting Miles to run little academic podcasting workshops. Then I got a message from the university's bureaucracy. Dallas, we want to talk to you about your podcast. I was like, oh, and that meeting came flashing back to me. The last communication I had about the podcast was basically telling me someone telling me, don't make a podcast. The university's got a podcast. So I go into the meeting, they're like, we've heard your podcast on the radio, podcasting is this new thing. We need to get involved in podcasting. We need to get your podcast on the University of Sydney's website. We need to get it all branded up with the University of Sydney's colours, etc. And I basically said to them, sorry, like, that ship has sailed. We've got a partnership with 2SER, we're all branded with them, we've got agreements. And I was disappointed at that, and probably take some share of blame. I should have engaged the university in a discussion about podcasting instead of literally just leaving and doing it on my own. So I think it was a missed opportunity for both sides. So I think the key takeaway here from this experience is that large organisations like universities need to be shown how they can be more innovative research communication partners. And this will require a radical rethink of what a contemporary research academic is, what a research institution is, and indeed what research communication is. Research communication is a core part of our job as researchers. How we communicate our research is constantly changing, but I think if you are a researcher, communication is something that is central to the process. More than that, we are constantly communicating our research. When we're in the classroom teaching students, that's research communication. When we write research papers, that's research communication. When we're on Twitter or LinkedIn, that's research communication. So take this seriously. Think about the different audiences we can engage with via these different communication mediums. Think about the different ways we can structure our communication to serve its audience. And we have to adjust the tone and style of our communication accordingly. We need to be creative with our research communication too. We need to think a little bit outside the box. On Thursday this week, we're launching an app we built as part of our linkage project, and we've engaged a social media influencer that is working right in the space of a huge audience of people that are concerned about the issues that our ARC linkage project is working with. So we're doing a bit of an experiment and working with a social media influencer to see what it would be like to communicate research in this way. So we can't always rely on our research institutions to be innovators here. We need to move with the times. We always need to be on the lookout for new ways to share, disseminate, and educate our research. Thanks so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dallas. And I love this approach of asking for forgiveness, not permission, and see where it can get you in the university. We do have time for questions, and I think we have a roving mic. So please bring forth questions. All the way to the back. Thank you. I'll be the runner. I love it. Get my steps in.
So much for sharing. I was really interested, so obviously you said that the Sound Lines Radio you finished up when you left university. And obviously your current podcast, you said you kind of declined the university engagement. I was really interested in terms of who owns the podcast, what happens if you move universities, do you have any insights around, from your perspective, maybe how to be really strategic about that?
Yeah, so ownership is a really interesting one. So if I had put it onto the university website, it would basically become the property of the university. It would be owned by, so in the early discussions I had, the school got behind the project and they funded it and they said, we will do this thing out of the school. So that's where the kind of IP and control would lie. When I negotiated with the arrangement with the community radio station, we effectively negotiated a partnership between me and the radio station, and at that point the project became the property of the radio station and me, essentially. It kind of became the property of the arrangement and the agreement was between me as a researcher and 2SER, but 2SER kind of became the owners of it. It was a program on their radio station when it went onto the community radio network. It was a 2SER program, and I was pretty happy with that. I also am involved with community radio, and I was quite happy with that. So you do need to think about those questions about ownership up front. And I think the university is more, at that point in time, the university was going to have one podcast show, which they had ownership of, and they were able to curate the topics, and their target audience actually was alumni. They were like, we've got this huge alumni, and we want to make a podcast show for them. But I think now the university is starting to think about podcasts as like other outputs. And there's been a couple of experiences with peer reviewing podcasts. So I think now they probably see the ownership as team-based if you're doing a project or individually based. But I could pick up City Road now and move institutions and take it with me. I wouldn't, because out the front of my building is a road called City Road. So I think good question.
Great question. There's another one. Here.
Thanks for your presentation, it's fantastic. My question is actually really similar to that one. You said close to the end of the presentation that you're now collaborating with an influencer through a linkage project, and that's actually quite, I've never heard that before, but there's a lot of influencers who work in my research space as well. How do you, I guess, negotiate where the podcast is going to go? Because I imagine the influencer is going to want that property to themselves.
Yeah, so it's not a podcast. What we have done is, how much can I say? It goes live on Thursday. We built an app, so it's about the private rental sector and the way the project's about the private rental sector and the way the technologies have impacted the private rental sector. And a lot of technologies are sort of landlord focused, and so we can build a tenant focused app. So an app for tenants, and this social media influencer is like the New South Wales equivalent of Purple Fingers down here. And so I've got a big profile of people that are affected by the private rental craziness. And so what we've said is, you have your own brand, and we have our own project, and can we work together so that those things remain independent? So we have no editorial control over his brand or the production of his mates TikTok videos and stuff, and you've got no editorial control over what we do, but we will work together to tell a story about the technology and the rental situation together. And so we've been working in that space. So basically he's produced a series of videos where part of our app features in some of his videos. So yeah, that's how we've kind of managed the IP and the arrangement there. And we've been working with a communications company who has set up the whole communication piece of the research project. And they went through a massive vetting process of social media influencers. So they don't call themselves influencers, they call themselves educators. So, because there's a very, the thing we're dealing with social media influencers is basically skeletons in the closet. And they had to literally go through all of their posts back in time and make sure there wasn't anything in there that would then look bad on the research process. So it was like a pretty massive project to just find who is someone who aligns with your values, can talk to your project and not someone might dig something up and find something problematic in their social media history. But it's an experiment, so we're going to see what happens.
My question comes from, you touched on that in the chronological version and the collapse chronology from 2017 to today. The thing that came to my mind is everybody, as you foreshadowed, to your university, everybody's going to be doing a podcast. When are we going to get to a peer review thought about how that might look. I'm the editor-in-chief of a big journal in my field, and it's a really big responsibility. And you see that in the future.
Yeah. Sitting just behind you is someone who's doing a PhD by podcast. He might have better insights than me, but there is already plans to peer review podcasts. And we know how hard it is to peer review a journal article and find reviewers and to go through all of that stuff. So I think the first thing is that where we want to go? Is that how we want to evaluate the worth of those outputs, or do we go the more non-traditional research output method and have a different process where a small group of people sort of review it? Or I've never actually thought about, I've never tried to claim my podcast as research. So there's also that question. But they are. If you go out and you interview 20 people and you create a podcast series, you are as knowledgeable as someone who goes out and does 20 interviews about something and writes it up in a journal. So I think this just goes to the digitization and expansion of what we call research. And so I don't have any answers, but I think it just, I don't think research institutions, I don't think journals are very good at thinking about this new landscape that we're in, where I think people are just doing different things with the mediums and we're sort of playing catch up. We are going to put Amplify in as an NTRO, so that's the first NTRO we've done, so we'll sort of see how that plays out. Good question.
Thank you so much. It was very wonderful to see Tiger Bales as a young man. I didn't knew he was a much older fellow, so that was fascinating. I just had a couple of points. At academic board last week, the last academic board, I actually had this podcast added into the new IP policy, so which allows the IP to stay with the maker of it. I only think I got that because those policies were written by the science people, so you have no idea. But I do want to say that there is a very vibrant podcast reviewing process out there. Here at RMIT, we have the Practice Research Symposium PhD, so you can do a whole PhD by podcast with exegesis. And there are journals that will actually do that, and NTROs here are very well supported. My question is, though, workload, because this is the thing that I would, from radio backgrounds, I would love to have done a podcast and many of podcasts on a range of issues in my area, but I just can't get the workload recognised for that. So I just wonder how you negotiated that with the two universities.
Yeah. So I'm also heavily involved in community radio. So a dilemma that I've always tried to work out in my own head is where, for me there is no line, but where is the line between community radio journalist and university academic, and how do those two things go together? And they go together in some really weird ways, because just if you think about the ethics of something, ethics of research. If I'm a University of Sydney researcher, I go out and interview someone, I say, I'm not going to tell anyone who you are. Completely anonymous. And if I go and interview someone on the radio or podcast, I'm going to tell everybody who you are. I've always struggled to draw a line between my radio practice and my academic life, which has meant that I haven't been able to have very successful workload conversations, because my boss just says, well, you're on the board of Radio Skid Row, that must be your radio work. So the most success I had is when the school backed the podcast and they gave me cash, but they also gave me workload time. So I think we have to keep having those conversations. I'm a little bit worried about getting workload for them, but I don't know, do you have any tips?
Get a good manager who understands what it is.
Yeah. I see Michaela just there. I reckon Michaela would give me workload for it.
Thanks so much, Dallas. Also, as somebody who broadcasts out of hours and researchers within work hours. I was wondering, because you kind of got in on the ground floor with podcasting in the academic space. Have you seen a shift over time in the way that podcasting is assessed in terms of impact, and in terms of like peer recognition and university recognition of podcasting as like a legitimate research impact or a non-traditional research impact that is worth backing?
Yeah, so the most interesting shift I think I've seen. So podcasting and radio can be communication, they can be methodology, they can be politics, it can be so many things. But what I've seen is a shift to just communication. So the kind of politics of the medium and the using podcasts as methodology, I think, has been harder to argue for as a research institution that's seen the communication benefits of this. So I think about podcasting as something that comes at the end of a project. We get a big project, we do the research, and then we create a podcast to tell people about it. So I think that's the big shift I've seen, and I think it's awesome. Like, anybody who asks me to help me with a podcast, I will just say yes, and I've spent hours on Zoom helping people like play on podcasts, and I just love it. I think the danger is that it just becomes a communication medium, and I think we need to advocate and remind people that there's so much more than that. It's particularly a methodology as well. People can and are doing PhDs with them, so I think that's the challenge and some of the questions we think about that.
Great. Last question.
Thank you for sharing. I'm also a PhD candidate from the School of Architecture and Urban Design at RMIT, and I'm also studying something about the gentrified historical community, and also my study is in Sydney.
Excellent. We should have had you on the radio.
Thank you. My question is similar to the workloads. I'm interested in how you interpret that like a piece of the podcast, like every time from the beginning of the preparation, from the transcript or some plans or structures to recording or to some share and editing, something like that, and then do also you have a team to work with you like that to share something.
Yeah, good question. So I'm running a workshop tomorrow, actually, where we'll go through a lot of that. But so my life over the last 7 years at the university has got increasingly more crazy. So I had more time when I arrived, and now I've got no time. So I'm head of discipline, and I spend a lot of time doing administrative things. And so it's changed over time. I did everything when I first started City Road, and so I would release an episode a month, and so I would just take my time over the month to record the interview and edit it up in little blocks of time I had and get it ready and put it out. As my life has got crazier and City Road got more popular, I've been able to outsource the load. So now people come to me and they say, when I see, I want to report on the findings, I've got $5,000, and so I have a number of those happening at any one time, and I basically work with 2SCR, and I find radio producers that want some work, and to top up their work that they have at the community radio station, I get them in, and I basically give them a job. I just hand it over to them. I say, this is the tone style of City Road, this is our audience, off you go. Miles was the first one, and then he left City Road and got a job at The Guardian, his podcast team. Sam Dover was next, and he left us and went to SBS Insight. So we also have this history now of like people coming through. And I kind of see it as like, it's good for us because we're getting amazing radio production skills, but it's also, I think, good for the community radio sector, which has just been like so underfunded, and just we can sort of share the resources around there as well. So yeah, it's hard. I started doing everything myself, and now I've sort of like outsourced it. But I can tell you, like, finding somebody, do you know why people love people come out of community radio and work at the City Road? Because they can do everything. They can do an interview, they can work out what the hot topic is, they can do an interview schedule, they can go out in the field and interview people, they can bring it back, they can edit it in the studio, they can do the storytelling, they can be voiceover, the episode, and it's actually surprisingly hard to find someone with all those skills. If you have all those skills, there's like, yeah, there's a lot of work for it.
Fantastic. Talk about having an impact in the world. Amazing. Please join me in thanking Dallas once again for a fantastic. And please do stick around. Have a glass of wine, some cheese, nibblies, and a bit more time to chat with our speakers. Thank you so much for coming, everyone.